Welcome back, Waypoint kids. I'm so glad you could join me for another day of our Elements in Faith Lessons series. Today we're going to be making a marshmallow catapult for our science experiment. So you will need some large marshmallows, you will need wooden skewers, you're going to need a plastic spoon, rubber band, and some tape. And the first thing you're going to do is take 3 of your marshmallows and you are going to stick your skewers into the marshmallows. To make a triangular base. Now, we're going to take 3 more skewers, 1 more marshmallow, to connect it all together. The next step is taking one of your skewers and your plastic spoon, and we're going to use some tape to tape our spoon to our skewer. And you may want to use quite a bit of tape to make sure that this plastic spoon is securely on this skewer. So we're just going to wrap the tape around the spoon and the skewer. Once the spoon is securely attached, you're going to add your rubber band to the top of your marshmallows. More marshmallow. To connect it all together. The next step is taking one of your skewers and your plastic spoon. And we're going to use some tape to tape our spoon to our skewer. And you may want to use quite a bit of tape to make sure that this plastic spoon is securely on this skewer. So we're just going to wrap the tape around the spoon and the skewer. Once the spoon is securely attached, you're going to add your rubber band to the top of your marshmallows. Next, we're going to slide our spoon skewer through the rubber band and into the marshmallow. Through the rubber band and into the marshmallow. So the final step is to test your catapult. You're going to take one of your marshmallows and pull it into the spoon, and then you're going to hold your wooden skewers at the top, and you're going to pull down on your spoon so that the rubber band expands and let it fly. You might be wondering what the catapult was doing to help us to remember a lesson, but let's think about when we had somebody who was small and mighty and there was a big battle. Does anybody remember that story in the Bible? If you thought about David and Goliath, you're right. That's the lesson that we're going to be talking about today. David was this little boy. He was coming to the battlefield to feed his older brothers who were there. And Goliath was this massive giant who came and was always taunting all of the soldiers, saying, "Who will fight me? Who will fight me?" And David, being this young boy, and he saw this, he was thinking, what is happening here? Now, his job was a shepherd, and he was there to look after the sheep. And He would protect the sheep from predators, maybe lions or bears or wolves. And he would use his slingshot and he would use his wits. That's his smarts. And he would use those things to help protect his sheep. And he had faith. Faith so big. At the beginning of this series, we talked about how faith is believing in something that we cannot see. And science is using all of our facts and figures and experiments to prove something that really does happen. Well, with our science experiment today, the catapult, we were trying to use science to prove that if we had enough force, if something weighed enough, if we shot it far enough, and we were trying to justify all of the things to make something go. Just like when we think about David and his slingshot. Well, if his rock went at a certain speed, or maybe if it was a certain size or a certain shape or whatever it was, and science is telling us that we can determine how to beat something, how to figure it out. Fighters use science. The boxers decide what kind of diets they need. They decide how much training they need. Same thing with war. We use science to build airplanes and special armor. And now we're using science even to help protect our soldiers with the unmanned drones and other things that are going on. But David didn't use science. David used faith. We're gonna watch a little video, and I'm gonna warn you that at the end, it's kind of tough. It's a little brutal because David ends the battle in a very specific way. So if parents, you're watching this and you don't want your kid to see it, you can stop the video before the very last few seconds.
God's story, David and Goliath. So part of God's story is about the time David fought Goliath. And it begins like this. David was the youngest of 8 brothers. His job was being a shepherd, which meant he spent all day in a field watching sheep eat and roll around the grass. Meanwhile, some of his brothers were off with the Israeli army preparing for war against the Philistines. The Philistines were one of the toughest armies the people of Israel had to fight. So one day, David was taking food to his brothers because his dad asked him to. But when he got there, his brothers accused him of coming so he could watch the fight instead of the sheep. Since David knew in his heart he was just obeying his dad, he didn't mind being misunderstood. Anyway, while David was there, he saw a huge Philistine man, more than 9 feet tall, step onto the field between the two armies. He was wearing a thick helmet and armor and carrying huge weapons. His name was Goliath, and he was definitely used to being the winner. David found out that Goliath had been stepping onto the field like this every morning for the past 40 days and saying, "Give me a man and let us fight each other." But nobody from Israel was brave enough to fight him, even the king. Well, David didn't like that this giant was intimidating the Israelites. After all, they were God's special family. And because God was with the Israelites, they could have courage in any situation. So David, who wasn't even a soldier, told the king, "I'll fight against him." Nah, the king thought David was too small, but he really wanted someone to fight Goliath. So he gave in. And David knew he wasn't strong enough to beat Goliath by himself, but he believed God would be with him. So he said, "The Lord will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." The king hoped David was right. He even had his own weapons and armor put on David, but they didn't fit him. David decided to go into battle in his regular clothes. That's how sure he was that God would help him. Anyway, David went to a nearby stream and chose 5 smooth stones to use with his slingshot. Then he walked onto the battlefield to meet the massive Goliath. When Goliath saw how wimpy David looked, he was furious. He thought he'd get to fight the Israelites' strongest warrior. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals." David might have looked like a wimp, but he was actually really brave. In fact, he was so brave that when he was taking care of sheep, he fought off bears and lions. Because God helped him protect his sheep, David knew God would help him protect this special family. David said, "You come at me with a sword, but I come at you with the name of the Lord Almighty." He was explaining to Goliath that God was more powerful than anything. He also added that he would feed Goliath's flesh to the birds, which made the giant even more mad. Then David took a stone, put it in the slingshot, and slung it at Goliath. Goliath didn't even get a chance to swing a sword because the stone hit him right in the forehead and sunk in deep. He face-planted straight into the ground. Nobody could believe it. Then David ran over, took hold of the giant's sword, and drew it from the sheath. He took the sword and cut off Goliath's head. David carried the head all the way back to Jerusalem. And when the Philistine army realized Goliath was dead, they started running away like a bunch of scaredy cats. The Israelites chased the Philistines, shouting loudly. They had won. God used David, who was just an average kid, to rescue his people. And that's the story of David and Goliath. So, in case you missed it, here's the quick version. David was a shepherd. He brought his brothers lunch. He saw Goliath. Goliath scared everybody. David wasn't scared. He knew God was stronger. David fought Goliath. He used one stone. God helped him kill Goliath. The Israelites won. God's people were saved. And that's a part of God's story.
So, what did you think of that video? What did you notice? David was young. David was little. He was just half the size. Come on in.
Sorry,
It's okay.
there wasn't a sign. I'm sorry.
It's okay. David was this young man, and we had said he had faith. He loved God. He knew that he was going into battle and God was going to be there with him. David was one of the authors of Psalms, and in Psalms, it's all songs, it's worship, it's talking about how much he loved God and he had faith. He knew that when he stepped onto that battlefield, God was going to be with him. Now, we can use our science to measure the force. We can use how fast it was going and how quickly it was, and we can try and answer all of the questions like, how did this happen? What happened? How fast? Where was it at? What was the right hit? What's the right angle? But none of that will explain why David stepped onto that battlefield. This young boy stepped onto that battlefield, and his only answer is faith. He knew that God would be with him. He knew how much God loved him. He knew how much God loved his people, and he would never leave them. So David used that courage, the strength of God, and the faith that he had to step onto that battlefield. You guys might be little, but just like David, your faith can be big. Your courage can be big. So this week, I hope that you think about that story of David and Goliath, and I hope that you remember that your faith can be big, that God loves you, and that he's never going to leave you. I hope you guys have a great week.